Place a farmer in the forest to gather wood. Use the wood to build fences. Collect some livestock to fill your pastures. Cook the livestock to feed your farmer. That's the flow of a worker placement game. Except there's hardly any wood, because the other farmer got there first. So you can only build a tiny pasture, which means you can't fit all the livestock, and your farmer's going hungry, so you end up taking a begging card, and oh great, now Hans Peter has nicked the start player token. Yeah, that's the true worker placement experience. I'm Adam Porter, I'm a game designer from Wales, and I've been fascinated by worker placement games for a decade. It's daunting making a video like this because worker placement is one of the big mechanisms. It has a wide appeal and it's adaptable to many different themes and genres. Worker placement games can be simple or they can be incredibly complex, and they're everywhere. A lot of gamers love worker placement games, and inevitably I'm going to miss out a huge number of important titles in the category, simply because I haven't played them or I don't have access to a copy. But I'm going to plough on regardless and show you a bunch of my favourite worker placement titles. I'm going to highlight 10 or so design choices which you might want to consider when designing your own worker placement game. Even better, look at what's been done before. Find a gap, subvert a mechanism, and create something totally new. Before we dive deep into the world of worker placement, I've got a message I'd like to share with any game designers watching this channel. This video is sponsored by Launch Tabletop. I'm putting together a card game prototype with the intention of pitching it later this year. Launch Tabletop is a board game manufacturer with a print-on-demand service called Launch Lab. I got great results with my first prototype board game, so now I'm exploring the options for printing a deck of cards. I've created my artwork using the simple templates, and I'm going to try out a range of the different card options so I can show you the results when they arrive in a week or two. Linen cards, thick white core, black core, tuck boxes, and mint tins. So far, so good. The simple user interface guides you through the process, and your game will be posted to you wherever in the world you're located with an incredibly fast turnaround time. And judging by my last attempt, the quality of a Launch Lab prototype is indistinguishable from professionally published games. If you'd like to create a single copy of your game, or anything up to 1,000 copies, then visit launchtabletop.com and start prototyping. Use the coupon code ADAMINWales for a 20% discount. And we're back to the topic at hand. I've got a worker, right? He's a farmer, just like the farmers in Agricola, and on my turn, I place him in a field. That's worker placement, right? Well, yes and no. Upon closer examination, some games where you place workers aren't worker placement games, and some worker placement games don't feature workers. So what gives? I think we need a definition. Worker placement is a thematic description. That's to say, it describes a narrative of sending our little in-game avatars out to take actions. If you're looking for a more mechanical term, we'd generally opt for action drafting. Though that description might include games where, instead of placing workers, players remove components, as in Village, or select an action tile, as in San Juan. While the decision space here is similar, thematic description worker placement doesn't quite fit. The term worker placement appears to have been first used around the release of William Attia's castle building game Caelus in 2005, and then retroactively applied to earlier titles with similar rule sets. There are two commonly cited candidates for the first worker placement game: Quidam and Bus. Richard Breese's Quidam was the earliest in 1998. The game was re-released in 2022 under the new title of Quidam's Dragons. In this game, players take turns to place workers in different locations, but each worker has a different value, and they're all placed face down. When all have been placed, they're revealed, and the player with the highest sum total from all of their workers gets to take the action, while the other players are excluded. Earlier titles, Silverton, Merlin, and Burp, are all listed as worker placement on the Board Game Geek database, but like Quidam, they don't closely resemble worker placement as we know it in 2023. Splotter-Spellen's Bus is the other commonly cited candidate for first worker placement game. Released in 1999, this game is much closer to the mechanism as we know it today. On their turn, players place a pawn on a board location in order to select an action. The simple act of placing such a token denies other players access to that action for the rest of the round. Now, it's hard to pin down an exact definition of worker placement because there's no authority, just an emergent gamer jargon which has evolved at a pace over the last couple of decades. Board Game Geek is not the arbiter of board game terminology, but they are a central hub for tabletop gamers worldwide, so their definition is as close to authoritative as we're going to get. According to BGG, worker placement games involve placement of tokens to trigger an action from a set of actions available to all players, generally one at a time and in turn order. Each player usually has a limited number of tokens with which to participate in the process, although these may increase as the game progresses. There's usually a limit on the number of times a single action may be taken. For purposes of BGG classification, action blocking is a defining element of worker placement. So in this video, we're going to explore games which fit neatly into this definition and games which stretch it. What is it about worker placement games that catches people's imaginations? How did they become so popular? The darling mechanism of Euro game designers. If you've ever watched any of my reviews, you'll know that I rate games based on 5 criteria: immersion, interaction, tension, feedback, and decisions. The worker placement genre contains some of the most immersive games out there. Designers sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that we make games thematically immersive by filling cards with flavour text, including elaborate plastic miniatures and tons of lavish artwork. But in reality, games are most immersive when they make sense and describe a logical narrative. In the woodland town building game Everdell, we gather resources to build buildings, which house a community of woodland creatures, who each specialise in a specific task, making it easier to gather further resources, or industriously converting one resource into another. Worker placement games can be as interactive as a designer wishes. By definition, there's always a degree of blocking, preventing other players from accessing the spot which you're utilising, or making it more expensive for them to do so. This interaction can really be cranked up. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more cutthroat strategy game than Caelus. Tension is a hallmark of the genre. Again, there's a lot of scope for designers to calibrate the game for their preferred taste, and Agricola is known for being extremely stressful to play, with the requirement to feed your workers constantly hanging over you. Agricola's sequel, Caverna, deliberately tones down this tension, making it easier to substitute resources and giving the game a different tone. Worker placement games excel at providing feedback. You interact with the board and components just as much as you interact with the other players. Resources are continuously moved around the table, gathered, converted, traded, and used to improve your engine. Most worker placement games feature a tableau growing in front of each player, a selection of rule-breaking options, set collection objectives, and point-scoring components. When playing well, each turn feels better than your last. There's usually a strong sense of momentum in a worker placement game. In the sci-fi game Asking for Troubles, players gradually improve their spaceship by adding connections, and these increase the rewards for the player every time they visit a specific board location. Finally, worker placement games provide a wealth of options for the players on every turn. There are usually many things you'd like to be doing, and you're never going to achieve all of them. The key decision in a worker placement game is which action do I prioritise, and how do I adapt when I discover my preferred option is no longer available. Under my ladder engagement system, a game scores 0 to 3 points for each category, and each point scored climbs the game one rung up the ladder. A score of 10 or above tops the ladder and indicates a really engaging time. Frankly, if a worker placement game is adequately designed, it's going to have a hard time not achieving 10 points. So let's take a look at a bunch of worker placement games and see how designers have developed the formula to make their products stand out. Number 1. Scarcity of rewards. In a worker placement game, you visit a location to receive a reward, and the rewards are generally distributed in one of 3 ways. In some games, the reward is unique. That is to say that once a player collects that reward, it's no longer available for any other player for the rest of the game. That's the case with many of the action spaces in Raiders of the North Sea, where Vikings raid various locations, gathering plunder from the board, but never refilling. Another example would be the point-scoring event tiles in Everdell. Once visited by a worker, these spaces are never replenished. In most games, there are spaces which offer up a consistent reward which is always available, no matter how often players visit that location. Gathering wheat in Agricola works in this way, as does gathering space carrots in Asking for Troubles. In some games, resources accumulate if an action spot is not taken. This feature was used extensively in Agricola. It adds a nice push your luck aspect to the game. Should I take that wood now or wait for a later turn when it could be even more packed with resources? The feature was utilised to a lesser extent in the mystical Mayan game Tzolk'in in 2012, with the start player action amassing corn tokens every time it goes unused. Number 2. Timing of rewards. In many worker placement games, the reward is received as soon as you place your worker. In the winemaking game Viticulture, when you place your worker, you immediately draw a card, or build a structure, or plant a vine. There's no delay. The benefit is instant. And this is the case in many other worker placement games, including Agricola, Everdell, and Architects of the West Kingdom. From my internet research, it appears that Martin Wallace's Way Out West was the first worker placement game to utilise immediate rewards. This wasn't the case in the earliest worker placement games. In Quidam, Bus, and Caelus, players all take actions in turn order, and then the action spaces are resolved in sequence. In that sense, the games resemble action programming, creating a chain of events in advance and then watching the sequence play out. You need to plan several turns ahead. I'm going to take this action, which will get me this reward, which will allow me to fulfill the requirements of this other action. And these two approaches to collecting rewards creates a very different tone. The distinction was highlighted in 2021 with the release of Dominant Species Marine. The original Dominant Species was a complex worker placement title from 2010 and one of my favourite games. The original used the delayed reward system, while the Marine sequel utilised immediate rewards. In other regards, the games were very similar. This single change gave Marine a much more immediate tactical feel, while the original Dominant Species felt slower and more strategic. Of course, the challenge for players in action programming games is that other players might resolve their actions in such a way that it disrupts your own plan and makes some of your later actions suboptimal. Caelus has become infamous because of one such cutthroat mechanism. All the action spaces in Caelus sit along a path, and after workers are placed, the spaces are resolved in sequence from the start of the path, heading up towards the castle. The provost is a special token, presumably some sort of mayor or dignitary, which sits along the path. Players can take actions which allow them to move the provost, and because this is a delayed reward worker placement game, the provost movement happens after players have selected their actions. If any action spaces are positioned beyond the provost after it moves, then those actions will not be resolved, even if a worker has been allocated to them. Hence, the threat of the provost hangs over players like a cloud, and players need to be cautious about placing their workers too far along the path. Number 3. Climb a track. Tzolk'in makes a heavy use of tracks. Taking an action and spending resources might allow you to advance on a technology track, giving you bonuses when you take certain actions later in the game, or on the temple tracks, which award resources or points at key moments throughout the game. Architects of the West Kingdom is another game featuring tracks. Players ascend or descend the virtue track when they take different actions throughout the game. Using the black market costs you virtue. Providing goods to the king's storehouse or paying off debts gains it back. Sitting high on the virtue track limits your access to the more corrupt action locations, but sitting low on the virtue track stops you contributing to the building of the cathedral. The cathedral is a second track, which players race to climb by discarding the indicated resources and a building card. And the higher your position at game end, the more points you'll score. But the cathedral gets narrower as you approach the top, so the sooner you start climbing, the more likely you are to find a space in the higher sections. In Raiders of the North Sea, there are 2 tracks, in addition to the standard scoring track. The red track represents armour, and your total here is combined with a dice roll and the total of your crew cards to establish your strength on a raid. The black Valkyrie track is climbed every time one of your crew dies, and this awards victory points at game end. Now, tracks are one of my least favourite staples of the genre. I'd always prefer to handle a physical component, a resource, an animal token, or a coin, even a cube, than climb an abstract track, which makes the game resemble a spreadsheet. They tend to lift me out of the theme. If I'm building a temple or a cathedral, I want to see it. I'm more accepting of tracks when they represent something intangible, like happiness, status, or virtue. Turn order is frequently critical in worker placement games. If you aren't playing first, you may not get to visit your desired location. This is particularly vital in games with accumulation spaces. Like Tzolk'in, Agricola offers up a start player action space whereby that player places a worker to claim the start player token, meaning that they'll play first in the following round, and turn order will continue clockwise around the table from there. Now this creates a strange dynamic where you can luck into an early position in turn order, perhaps second to play, simply because the player on your right selected the start player action. In dominant species, players take actions to manipulate turn order on an initiative track, so turn order is not dependent on your position around the table. The original Caelus had players take turns in the order in which they passed in the previous round. Now that's a fairer, more strategic system. But players are conditioned to clockwise turn order, and it's telling that this rule was simplified to play clockwise from start player in the reimagined Caelus 1303. Number 5. Variable setup. Worker placement games lend themselves well to a variable setup, offering a bit of variety from game to game by providing new options in each session. In Everdell, there are a number of standard action spaces printed on the board, one which allows you to gather each of the basic resources. But players select additional action spaces randomly drawn from a deck at the start of each game, and these will change the availability of different resources. For example, in one game, pebbles might be extremely abundant, while in another game they're in short supply. This is a great way of forcing players to adapt their strategy from game to game. Now, Agricola does not feature different action spaces between games, but a new action space is made available at the start of each round, and the order in which the action spaces appear is variable. Even if games have consistent action spaces from game to game, many provide asymmetric powers for the players, and these are variable. In Tzolk'in, players select a combination of starting resources. In the Everdell expansions, each player receives a rule-breaking ability, and in Architects of the West Kingdom, players get a mix of both. Some worker placement games allow players to introduce new action spaces throughout the game, widening the available options. This is a major part of Caelus, which features construction action spaces, which allow you to build increasingly powerful locations, which are then positioned along the track for all players to utilise. In Caelus, the basic action spaces slowly become unavailable throughout the game, as players turn them into residences and eventually point-scoring monuments. This shift from basic actions to more powerful ones gives the game a forward momentum. In Everdell, players can build constructions with worker placement locations in their own personal card display. If other players choose to use these spaces, the owner of the card earns a point. This harks back to Caelus, where players place a marker to indicate that they own the worker placement spot they've built, and thereafter gain a kickback whenever another player uses it. And likewise, in Yellow's Little Town, players discard resources to construct buildings on a grid, marking ownership by placing houses on them. When you place a worker, all the buildings in the 8 surrounding spaces activate in an order of your choosing. If you activate any buildings belonging to another player, you must first pay them a coin. Dare I relate this mechanism back to Elizabeth McGee's 1904 Landlord's game, later rebranded as Monopoly? Nah, let's leave it. Cathedral is one of many Kingdom sequels. The Key series of games frequently feature clever twists on worker placement. In Cathedral, players position tiles to build a landscape at the start of the game. Each tile is an action space, and players strategically place their own cottages between tiles to give themselves access to the adjacent actions. On your turn, you select a numbered pawn, and then all players select an action space adjacent to their own cottage of that number. These action spaces will each generate resources, and players can later build fences to limit their opponent's access to certain action spaces. Number 6. Specialised and neutral workers. Keyflower is probably the most well-known of Richard Breese's Key series. One of the twists in Keyflower, and there are many, it's a very unusual game, is that the workers do not belong to any specific player, and frequently change hands. When a worker's played on an action space in another player's village, that player keeps the workers at the end of the round. And if a worker's played on a neutral tile in order to utilise its action, that worker will be collected by whichever player purchases the tile to join their own display. In Raiders of the North Sea, each player starts the game with one worker, but that worker doesn't stay with you. It shifts between players as the game progresses. On your turn, you place a worker, And then you collect a worker, and that simple twist gives the game its unique identity. Placing a worker activates a location, but so does removing one. So on each turn, players get to pair up two actions to maximise their rewards. Pulling off a powerful combo is really satisfying, and generally not possible with the one-action turns utilised in most worker placement games. But Raiders gives us a little taste of combo excitement without overcomplicating things. Place a worker, take a worker might seem like the equivalent of moving your worker from one spot to another, similar to the movement of your dragon worker in Flamecraft. But the difference in Raiders of the North Sea is that workers come in 3 distinct colours, and each is specialised to do certain tasks, so the worker which you retrieve at the end of your turn might be quite different to the one you placed on the board. If you're visiting the silversmith, it's the black worker you're going to want to maximise your reward, but if you're raiding a fortress, you're going to need a white. In the OG worker placement game Kingdom, players each had their own pool of workers, and each worker had a numeric value which determined its strength when competing with other players for rewards. Viticulture Essential Edition introduced a Grande worker. While generally utilising the traditional one worker per action space rule, in this game each player has one special worker which is allowed to break the standard action blocking rule. In Everdell, all workers are considered equal, but the Spirecrest expansion introduces massive creatures which act as upgrades to specific workers in your pool, allowing them to break the rules in a variety of interesting ways. For example, when you place Honeypaw, you gain 1 berry for each other resource you took from an action space. Whisper functions like the Grande worker from Viticulture, accessing occupied action spaces. Stubblehoof may choose to remain on a location at the end of a round and reactivate it, gaining additional resources. The most extreme examples of distinct and specialised workers come in dice placement games such as Marco Polo, Brew or Castles of Burgundy, where players use dice as their workers, generating resources based on the number or icons they've rolled and then placing onto worker placement spaces. Dice placement games are a genre in their own right, so I'm not going to consider these in any depth in this video, a topic for another day. It's frequently an option in a worker placement game to use an action space to generate an additional worker, sometimes temporary, as in Snowdonia, but most commonly as a permanent addition, allowing you to achieve more in future rounds. Gaining a worker is often a very powerful move, and frequently prioritised in the early game, because extra workers essentially allow you additional turns compared to other players. One tool that designers frequently utilise to mitigate against the overpowered extra worker action is the infamous feed your workers mechanism. In Agricola, not only do you need to build enough rooms to house your extra workers, but when a harvest comes round, all your workers need to be fed, and food is hard to come by. If your workers go hungry, you'll be taking begging cards, and these are worth a substantial number of negative points at game end. Frequently, these feeding episodes are spaced out throughout the game, occurring when a specific milestone is reached. Tzolk'in features 4 such milestones. Food days, which happen at the end of specific rounds in the game. On each of these food days, players are forced to feed their workers with corn. On 2 of them, players receive resources, depending on their positions on the temples, and on the other 2, players receive points. In Agricola, the harvest happens after specific rounds spaced out throughout the game, and becoming more frequent as you approach game end. In addition to feeding your farmers, your animals will multiply. It adds momentum to the game, and the sense that your farm is actually vital, with produce growing and livestock breeding. In Architects of the West Kingdom, the key event which shakes things up is called a Black Market Reset. The workers currently at the Black Market are moved to prison. Various ability cards activate, players with workers in prison lose virtue, and the player with most workers in prison takes an unpaid debt card. Unlike Tzolk'in and Agricola's harvests and food days, the Black Market Reset is not entirely predictable. The timing of the event is dictated by the choices made by the players. Specifically, the reset happens when the black market spaces are filled with workers, or when a certain number of workers have been placed at the guild hall. Allowing the players to collectively determine the timing of a significant event is one way of increasing the number of meaningful choices in a game. But it also adds tension, because players can never be absolutely sure when the event is going to occur. Everdell is played over 4 seasons, and at the end of each season, players take new cards, or activate their existing cards, and gain new workers. The slightly awkward twist in Everdell is that each player can choose when they want to progress from one season to another. So one player could be in autumn, while another is in summer, or even hanging back in the spring. This might even result in some players ending the game before others. It's thematically awkward, but it does add to the decisions in the game. When should I progress to the next season? Is there more that I need to be achieving, or am I getting left behind? If action blocking isn't enough to crank up the tension, Viticulture makes a distinction between summer and winter actions. Players don't get their workers back until winter is complete, so you'll need to make sure that you haven't used all your workers in the summer, leaving you without any tokens to carry out winter actions. Number 9. Bringing workers home. In Agricola and dominant species, workers are returned to players at the end of each round. It's simply part of the sequence of play, ensuring every player has their full complement of workers at the start of a new round. This is the default approach for handling workers in worker placement games. In later worker placement games, this frequently isn't the case. Regaining workers is an active step, something players need to build into their strategy. One of the major revisions from 2005's Caelus to Caelus 1303, published in 2019, is the way that workers return to the players. Caelus used the basic get your workers back at the end of the round approach, but the sequel changed that. In the later game, any worker which has been placed onto the board is returned to a central supply, and players have to utilise specific action spaces to bring them home. Architects of the West Kingdom has a particularly intricate and thematic system for returning workers to players. Each player starts the game with a large number of workers, and when they're placed on the action spaces, they stay there, with the actions becoming more and more powerful as the number of workers increases. There is, however, an action space which a player can utilise to capture groups of other players' workers, placing them into their own player board. By using the guardhouse action, the player can imprison these workers, earning silver for doing so. And the other players can use the guardhouse action to free their workers from jail on a later turn. In Tzolk'in, on your turn, you either place your workers or bring them home. Released in 2012, Tzolk'in is probably the most radically innovative game in the worker placement genre. The action spaces are distributed around several giant cogs, and at the start of each round the central cog is turned and the surrounding cogs rotate with it. This takes any placed worker tokens along for the ride, and rewards from action spaces are only collected when a worker is retrieved, so the longer the worker remains in position, the better rewards they receive. Asking for Troubles goes for something similar, but much simpler and more intuitive. On your turn, you either place a worker or you bring all your workers home. However, if another player places a worker on an action space which is currently occupied, they bump the worker off that space, returning it to its owner, saving them a job. So action spaces are never blocked. Wait a minute, action spaces are never blocked? So that means Asking for Troubles is not a worker placement game, right? Well, that's where things get tricky. In every other regard, Asking for Troubles feels exactly like a worker placement game. Place tokens on action spaces to gather resources and convert them into victory points. It's a very familiar formula, so perhaps it's the definition that's wrong. In Asking for Troubles, you're paying a tax of sorts. You're gifting your opponent a free turn by returning their worker to them. It's not directly harming your own prospects, but helping opponents is certainly to your detriment. If you bump one of your own workers off a location, then the worker is destroyed. So it does squeak into the worker placement family by a whisker. And number 10, action blocking. For purposes of BGG classification, action blocking is a defining element of worker placement. So what is action blocking? I've saved the most contentious aspect of worker placement games for last. In its simplest form, action blocking means exactly that. When you place a worker on a location, neither you nor any other player is able to utilise that same location for the rest of the round, or in some cases, the rest of the game. But this is one of the biggest design spaces in the worker placement genre, and it's ripe for innovation. Frequently, blocking is not so clear-cut. Flamecraft is a worker placement game where each player only has one dragon worker. Your dragon can be placed on any of the shops except for the one that you visited last. And if you visit a shop which is already occupied, there's nothing stopping you. You'll just need to pay the other players on the location 1 resource each. In Keyflower, the first player to activate a location only needs to place a single worker. If anybody wants to activate the location for a second time though, they'll need to place 2 workers, and the third visit will cost 3 workers. Architects of the West Kingdom features several different types of location. The Black Market has small open circles indicating that only 1 player can position a worker in that location until it's vacated. But most locations feature wide open circles, and in these spots any number of workers can be placed, and each subsequent worker that you place gains a greater reward because of the presence of other workers of your colour on that location. Despite feeling very much like worker placement, these spaces wouldn't fulfill the definition because of the lack of action blocking. Dominant Species Marine is a game where you can block your own access to action locations. You need to think carefully about the order in which you place your pawns. After placing a worker, you're not allowed to place any subsequent worker in a higher position on the board, so you need to start towards the top and work your way down. This generates tension because the most desirable spots are lower on the chart, so you might decide to leave a particularly appealing spot for later, and that leaves open the possibility that another player might grab it before you get another chance. The game does, however, feature specialised workers who can break that top-down placement rule, and also they can bump other players off their spots in a similar manner to the spaceships in Asking for Troubles. Players gain these special pawns throughout the game by dominating certain elements on the board, and the special workers also have access to unique action spaces which other pawns can't use. So when should you, as a game designer, utilise worker placement mechanisms in your games? Well, I think worker placement is an excellent tool for theme-first design. You might have a unique twist on the worker placement system, but you're going to want to pin down your setting before you delve too deep into the design. Action drafting is a versatile tool, and the theme will push you down particular paths and inform your decisions about the specifics of the worker placement system. So to summarise, here's a few questions to ask yourself if you're dabbling in this genre. How many workers do you want? 1 lone worker, a small handful, or loads? Can your players get any extra workers throughout the game? And are they permanent or are they temporary? Is there any downside to this? Do your workers need feeding? Are all workers equal? Or do some of your workers have special abilities unique to them? Do your players control their own workers? Or are all workers considered neutral? When do workers get their rewards? Immediately after placement? At the end of the round? Or perhaps they don't get the reward until they're brought back home. Talking of bringing them home, how do players get their workers back? Automatically at the end of the round, or does it take an action to bring them home? Turn order is hugely impactful in a worker placement game, so how are you going to manage this? Can players claim a start player token? And how does the turn sequence go from there? Clockwise, or some other order? And what do your action spaces do? Can players build a personal tableau? Can they gather resources? Are the rewards always consistent? Or can resources accumulate? Do players climb any tracks? What do they do? Does your game feature absolute action blocking? If a space is occupied, can no other worker access it? Or could they use the space at a cost? Are there any further limitations on the use of action spaces? And are the action spaces always the same? Or could you incorporate a variable setup? Can players introduce new action spaces throughout the game? Are there any key events in the game? A change of season or harvest? And how does this impact on the players? And when does it happen? Predictably? At regular intervals? Or at the time determined by the players' in-game decisions? If you're a designer, I hope this video has given you an idea of some of the tools available to you when creating games featuring worker placement. If you're a game player and a fan of the genre, maybe there are 1 or 2 games here that weren't on your radar, but now you might consider giving a try. If you'd like to watch a similar video about totally different mechanisms, follow one of the links, and I'll see you next time. All the best.